Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Hey everyone, ready for a deep dive into a year that really shook things up? We're going back to 1972. Picture this. The counterculture at its peak, slamming right into a presidential election.
It's a year that still shapes how we think about politics even today.
Absolutely. And we're using this awesome piece from Mr. Hutchings' History as our guide. It's like a time capsule, you know?
It really shows how elections are part of a bigger story, influenced by all the social stuff going on around them.
Right. So before we get into 72 itself, we got to rewind a bit back to 68. Remember the Democratic Convention in Chicago? Total chaos, protests, the whole world watching.
Yeah, that was a mess for the Democrats. It showed how divided they were, the old guard versus this younger generation demanding change. And that's where the McGovern-Fraser Commission comes in.
Ah, yes, the McGovern-Fraser Commission. Can you break that down for us? What was so important about it?
Well, they basically overhauled how the Democrats nominated candidates. The whole point was to include more voices, especially young people, women, minorities, folks who felt ignored.
It was a huge power shift then. Huge. It was a real attempt to reflect those new left ideals.
Wow, so one chaotic convention led to this whole restructuring of the party.
It shows just how strong that push for change was. And then, into this whole scene, steps George McGovern, the Democratic nominee for 72. His platform was, well, let's just say it was pretty radical for the time.
Yeah. He was talking about economic fairness, civil liberties, really shaking up the American dream. But he also stirred up a lot of controversy, especially with those three A's, acid, abortion, and amnesty. Why were those such hot-button issues?
You got to remember what was happening then. Vietnam War raging, the civil rights movement pushing for equality. There was this feeling that the whole system needed an overhaul.
So those issues became symbolic of something much bigger.
Exactly. They represented this clash between traditional values and that whole counterculture wave.
And Republicans under Nixon, they weren't going to let that slide.
Not at all. They painted McGovern as this radical, totally out of touch with everyday Americans.
And then there's the 72 Democratic Convention itself. I read in Mr. Hutchings' History that some delegates even nominated Mao Zedong, the leader of Communist China, as McGovern's running mate. What was going on there?
It was chaotic, for sure.
Yeah.
Kind of shows the new left's struggles. Tons of passion, but not always a clear plan for turning those ideals into actual political action.
Yeah, so you've got calls to legalize marijuana, nominations for Chairman Mao, a platform challenging the status quo. Doesn't exactly scream electable, does it?
You could say that.
Yeah.
And the media, well, they loved it. They just amplified this image of the Democrats as a total mess. Perfect for Nixon.
And then boom, the election results come in. Nixon wins big.
Yeah, massive landslide for Nixon. McGovern only won Massachusetts and Washington, D.C. Nixon took over 60% of the popular vote. That's a pretty clear message.
Wow, so what happened after that? What did this mean for the Democrats?
Well, they had a major identity crisis on their hands.
So they're reeling from this huge defeat. Where do they go from here? How do they pick up the pieces?
They had to figure out who they even were anymore.
Right. They tried to embrace this counterculture thing, and it backfired big time.
Exactly. They needed to figure out how to connect with more voters without ditching, their core beliefs.
Sounds tricky, trying to balance those demands for change with actually winning elections.
Totally. There was a lot of soul-searching going on within the party. Some folks wanted to go back to more centrist policies.
Kind of like back to the basics.
Yeah, exactly. But others were like, no way, we got to stick to those progressive ideals from the McGovern campaign.
So what did Mr. Hutchings' History say about how they navigated all this?
Well, it wasn't like this sudden switch. It was more of a gradual shift.
Okay, so how did that play out? What did they start doing differently?
They started focusing on stuff that resonated with more people. Things like jobs, the economy, healthcare.
Stuff that affects everyone, basically.
Right. And they tried to distance themselves from, the more extreme parts of the new left. Emphasize their commitment to, traditional values.
Almost like trying to win back some of those silent majority voters Nixon had appealed to.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. They realized that they couldn't just focus on their existing base. They had to reach out to those folks who felt kind of left behind by all the rapid changes happening around them.
It's interesting, this idea of the silent majority. There were all these people who weren't super politically active, but were kind of freaked out by where the country was headed.
And Nixon was really good at tapping into that fear. He presented himself as this steady hand,
Hmm.
someone who could bring back a sense of normalcy after all that chaos in the 60s.
Did it work, though, this new approach by the Democrats? Did they manage to get back on track?
It was slow going. It took time to rebuild their image, win back trust, but they started making progress. They won back control of Congress in 74, then elected Jimmy Carter president in 76.
It's interesting that Carter, a pretty moderate Democrat, came to power after all that craziness.
It shows that the Democrats were adapting, trying to read the room, so to speak. Carter campaigned on honesty, integrity, just getting things done.
But I'm guessing the shadow of 72 still loomed pretty large.
Oh, yeah, for sure. That fear of being labeled too liberal, too radical, it definitely stuck around.
So McGovern's loss became like this cautionary tale.
Exactly. It showed them the dangers of being seen as too far out there, too different from the mainstream.
But it also makes me wonder, did they overcorrect? Did they, swing too far in the other direction and abandon some of the things that made them, well, them?
That's a debate that's still going on. Some say the move to the center was necessary to win and actually make changes. Others think they diluted their message, didn't really fight for the people who needed them most.
Yeah, it's complicated, no easy answers. But one thing's for sure, 1972 had a huge impact on the Democrats.
Definitely. It forced them to really confront who they were, what they stood for. It wasn't just about winning an election, it was about their whole identity.
So we've talked about the impact on the Democrats, but what about the bigger picture? How did this election change American politics in general?
Well, one big outcome was the rise of conservatism.
Nixon's landslide must have been a real shot in the arm for them.
It totally was. It gave them momentum, showed them how to win, but it also contributed to this growing sense of polarization. Those cultural clashes that were so obvious in 72, they didn't just vanish.
They just kind of went underground.
Yeah, you could say that. Those divisions festered, creating this bigger and bigger gap between liberals and conservatives.
Like the 72 election drew this line in the sand.
That's a great way to put it. And that line, well, it just keeps getting deeper and deeper. We see it everywhere. Social issues, economic policies, even basic facts.
It's almost like 72 is the birth of the culture wars, right?
You could definitely make that argument. It wasn't just about candidates or parties. It was about two totally different ways of seeing the world. And that clash, well, it's still shaping our politics, our society, even today.
Wow, really makes you think, doesn't it? Elections aren't just about picking a president. They're about defining who we are as a country.
Absolutely. And the choices we make, well, they have consequences. Speaking of choices, this deep dive has definitely given us a lot to chew on. Before we wrap up, I have one last question, something to really ponder.
All right, so we've seen how things played out with Nixon's win, but now I'm kind of curious, what if it had gone the other way? What if, in some alternate universe, McGovern had actually won? What would that have looked like?
Ah, the big what if, right? It's a question historians love to debate. We can't know for sure, obviously, but we can make some educated guesses based on, McGovern's platform, the whole vibe back then.
Yeah, let's put on our speculation hats.
Yeah.
What might a McGovern presidency have actually been like?
Well, one major thing would have probably been the end of Vietnam, right away. He was totally against the war, promised to pull out all the troops.
So that would have had huge consequences, right? Both here and, on the world stage.
Oh, absolutely. It's not just about the war itself. It's about the whole shift in power that was happening. A McGovern win would have been a big move away from, the establishment and towards all these groups pushing for social change.
It would have been like, hey, the counterculture's vision is actually happening. A chance to really make things fairer.
Exactly. And who knows, it might have even, empowered those movements to push for even more. Imagine universal health care, serious environmental protection, real criminal justice reform, all happening back in the 70s. It's pretty wild to think about.
It's like we're peeking into this alternate timeline,
Yeah.
where America took a totally different path.
Well, I got to remember the other side of that coin, right?
Yeah.
The government probably would have had a ton of pushback from conservatives. That whole backlash against the counterculture, it was already brewing.
Yeah, even if he'd won the presidency, Congress might not have been on board with all those radical changes. He could have ended up stuck, unable to get much done.
That's a really good point. The whole political scene matters, not just the president. Even a victorious McGovern would face an uphill battle.
So even with a win, who knows if those big counterculture dreams would have actually come true?
Exactly. It's not a guarantee.
Yep.
But even if he hadn't gotten everything done, his presidency would still have been this massive turning point.
How so?
It would have been a sign that the old ways weren't working anymore, a chance to really imagine a different kind of future.
So it's all hypothetical, but the 72 election was clearly a big deal either way.
Oh, absolutely. It was about clashing ideologies, social upheaval, real political change. It was the end of one era and the start of another, but one we're still in today.
It makes you wonder, what if things had been different? What if the counterculture had actually won? What if America had really embraced a more radical path?
Those what-if questions are always worth thinking about, even if we can't know the answers.
Because history isn't just about what happened, right? It's also about all the possibilities, and sometimes those can be just as interesting as the actual facts.
It makes you think about the choices we make as individuals and as a society. Reminds us that the future isn't set. We have some say in how it turns out.
And that's a pretty powerful thought to leave with, I'd say. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into 1972. It's a year that still has a lot to teach us about the power of ideas, why we need to stay engaged in politics, and that a better future is always something worth fighting for.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.